Hey, Eagles Nation, I hope you're all having a great Wednesday. The Eagles are back in the spotlight, and this time, the Patriots are on the other side. After the frustrating loss to Baltimore, Philadelphia now has another opportunity to show improvement. And let's be honest, Eagles fans, hopefully, this game gives us fewer reasons to yell at the television, because if the Eagles can make this game a little less stressful, our blood pressure might actually survive the preseason. But jokes aside, this matchup against New England is important, especially with the Eagles getting valuable work against the Patriots this week, and another preseason game coming up this Saturday. So today we're going to break down what Eagles fans should be watching, the biggest storylines surrounding this matchup, and what could make this game much more important than just another preseason night. Now, without wasting any more time, let's get straight to the point, because the Philadelphia Eagles walked off the field in Foxborough with plenty to discuss after a highly competitive joint practice against the New England Patriots. But one piece of injury news immediately stands out above everything else. Jonathan Greenard may not be ready to begin the regular season. That is a major development for Philadelphia, because Greenard was not brought in to be just another rotational defender. The Eagles traded a third-round pick to acquire him and gave him $50 million in guaranteed money, making him one of the most important additions to the roster. But after already dealing with a shoulder issue that required off-season surgery, Greenard has now been dealing with a pectoral injury that had already placed him on the physically unable to perform list before training camp. Initially, the expectation was that this would be a short-term problem, but that outlook changed when defensive coordinator Vic Fangio expressed concern about Greenard potentially missing the beginning of the season, and that immediately raises a much bigger question for the Eagles. Could Greenard actually begin the year on the PUP list? If that happens, the consequences are significant. A player placed on the PUP list to begin the regular season must miss at least 4 games. For Philadelphia, that could mean entering the season without its biggest pass rushing addition against a schedule that immediately presents some difficult challenges. The Eagles open against Washington at Lincoln Financial Field, then travel to Tennessee in Week 2, face the Chicago Bears on the road in Week 3 on Monday Night Football, host the Los Angeles Rams in Week 4, and then travel to Jacksonville in Week 5. That is not an easy stretch to begin the year, and Greenard was specifically acquired to help replace the production Philadelphia lost from its previous pass rushing situation. If he cannot go, Nolan Smith and Jalen Hunt could see significantly more responsibility on the outside, and that puts even more pressure on the rest of the defensive line to create consistent disruption. The encouraging part is that Philadelphia still has tremendous talent on the interior of that defensive line. The Eagles believe they have one of the strongest defensive tackle groups in football, and the joint practice provided another reason to be confident in that unit. Jalen Hunt, in particular, had a huge day. One report from a Patriot source described him simply as a problem, and that fits with what Philadelphia has been seeing throughout the spring and summer. There has been growing anticipation that Hunt could be heading toward a breakout season, and his performance against New England only adds fuel to that conversation. Greenard's absence could also create opportunities for players trying to secure roster spots. More snaps could go to players such as AJ Epineza and Arnold Ebiketie, who showed some encouraging things during the practice, including the ability to contribute in coverage. Fangio also discussed Joshua Uche and O. Bernard, describing them as players still developing and essentially learning the system. According to Fangio, Uche is a little further along in his football development right now, and then there is another name worth watching closely. Ty Robinson, the 2025 4th-round pick, received positive feedback from Fangio after the Baltimore preseason game, with the defensive coordinator saying Robinson played well. That is important because Robinson appears to be fighting for a spot on the 53-man roster. Fangio's comments suggest that the young defensive tackle needed that kind of performance, particularly after being described as being on the edge of the roster picture. There were also several injury updates coming out of practice. Philadelphia had multiple players who did not participate, including Jakari Bennett with a knee issue, Grant Calcaterra with a back issue, Jonathan Jones with a shoulder issue, John Mechie with a pectoral issue, Damian Pierce with a hamstring injury, Sean Wade dealing with an eye and shoulder issue, Johnny Wilson with a knee issue, and Byron Young with a shoulder injury. There was some positive movement though. Tariq Castro-Fields was limited with a heel issue, Keyshawn James was limited because of an ankle problem, and Malek Lemon was upgraded to limited participation while working back from a hamstring injury. Devonta Smith was also limited for the second consecutive day because of his hamstring, but he was able to run routes and catch passes from Jalen Hurts. He did not participate in 7-on-7 or 11-on-11 work, so his status remains something to monitor closely. But while the injury situation is important, the most fascinating storyline from Foxborough was happening on the other side of the ball. A.J. Brown was practicing against the Eagles for the first time as a member of the Patriots, and the matchup everyone wanted to see happened immediately. Brown lined up against Quinyon Mitchell in the opening one-on-one period, and the crowd was completely locked in. There is plenty of history between these two players. They have battled each other repeatedly in Eagles practices, and there is clearly a level of respect between them. On this particular rep, Brown initially created separation and gave Drake May a window to make the throw, but Mitchell refused to give up on the play. He fought through the contact at the end of the route and managed to break up the pass. That was a strong early win for Mitchell, but Brown would have plenty of opportunities to respond, and he absolutely did. Throughout the rest of the practice, New England repeatedly targeted Brown, and he had significant success against the Eagles secondary. He beat Rick Woolen on a deep crossing route. He later won against Mitchell on a quick slant. He also appeared to beat Woolen again on a fade along the sideline, and that is where this practice becomes particularly interesting for Eagles fans who have been wondering about Brown's current level. Whatever opinions fans may have about his departure from Philadelphia, the performance itself was difficult to ignore. Brown did not look like a player who was finished. He was heavily involved in 7-on-7 and 11-on-11 work, caught roughly 5 or 6 passes according to the practice observations, and consistently found ways to create problems for the Eagles' defensive backs. Mitchell even joked afterward that Brown had gotten away with a hold on their opening matchup. Brown smiled while discussing the play, which only added another layer to an already fascinating reunion. At the same time, it is important to put some of these plays into context. Joint practices are not actual games, and quarterbacks cannot be hit. That matters because there was at least one play where Jihad Campbell appeared to have a clear path to Drake May on a linebacker blitz. If this had been a real game, Campbell likely would have gotten to the quarterback before the throw could develop. That is one of the difficulties of evaluating joint practices. A pass rush can completely win a rep, but the quarterback still gets the opportunity to release the football because defenders are required to pull up. That happened on a big play involving May and Brown. The throw was completed downfield, but the defensive pressure suggested that the play would have ended very differently in a real game. The subsequent replay also indicated that Brown did not actually get both feet down in bounds. Still, there were plenty of legitimate positives for Philadelphia. The Eagles' offense had success running the football against a Patriots defense that was one of the better units in football last season. Saquon Barkley found significant running room, and the offensive line created multiple explosive opportunities. That is an encouraging sign for an Eagles offense that will be looking to establish its identity once the regular season arrives. The Eagles defense also had moments of dominance, especially along the defensive front. Josh Hunt continued to make his presence felt, and the pass rush created problems even though the quarterbacks could not be hit. Jalen Hurts did throw a couple of interceptions during 7-on-7 work, including one that could have become a pick 6, but the context matters there as well. One of those throws was directed toward Brishan Covey, who is not expected to make the roster, so it is difficult to treat that play as if it were a normal game situation. There was also a positive offensive sequence when pressure was coming. The play call from Kevin Patolo allowed Hurts to let the pressure get upfield before making a back foot throw to Will Shipley, resulting in a big play. On the other side, Rick Woolen had a much tougher day than what Eagles fans had become accustomed to seeing from him earlier this offseason. Woolen was one of the standout players during the spring and mandatory minicamp period, but his stock has cooled somewhat after struggling during this practice. That does not mean Philadelphia should suddenly be concerned about his entire season, but it is something worth watching because expectations for him had become very high. And then there is Jake Elliott. The pressure is clearly building around the veteran kicker after a difficult stretch over the past couple of seasons. Elliott missed 2 of 5 kicks during the practice, with some of the attempts sailing, and that is not what Philadelphia wants to see from a player whose position can decide games in critical moments. Elliott had his struggles last season, although he was able to turn things around during the playoffs and played a major role during Philadelphia's Super Bowl victory over Kansas City. But the Eagles are going to need consistency from him again, and performances like this will naturally attract attention. The situational portion of practice ultimately gave New England the edge. Neither offense was able to reach the end zone in those situations, but the Patriots converted 2 field goals while Philadelphia came away without points. Tanner McKee also threw an interception on a later drive, while Andy Dalton started the practice at quarterback. So if you are looking strictly at who won the joint practice, New England probably deserves the slight edge. But that does not mean Philadelphia walked away empty-handed. The Eagles saw encouraging signs from the offensive line, Saquon Barkley's running lanes, the defensive front, Josh Hunt, and several young players fighting for roster positions. At the same time, the biggest concern is impossible to ignore. Jonathan Greenard's injury could have a direct impact on the opening weeks of the season, while the secondary showed some vulnerability against the Patriots receivers, especially with Brown making plays against his former teammates. And perhaps that is the biggest takeaway from this entire practice. There were reasons for Eagles fans to be encouraged, but there were also warning signs that deserve serious attention before the regular season begins. With Greenard's status uncertain, Josh Hunt continuing to make noise, A.J. Brown showing that he can still be a major problem, Rick Woolen experiencing a difficult day, and Jake Elliott adding another concern to the list, there is plenty for Eagles fans to debate after this practice. So now I want to hear from you. What was the biggest takeaway from the Eagles' joint practice with the Patriots, and how concerned are you about Jonathan Greenard potentially missing the start of the season? And that is exactly why the next few days are going to be so important for Philadelphia. This was only the first major test against New England, and there is still another joint practice before the Eagles return